Hi, so for live recorded drums, how can you go from a drum sound like this to a much more polished drum sound like this? So let's dive in and let's go. Okay, the tracks that you heard in the intro are actually from a recent Suoss song that we released called Suddenly Goodbye. I'll put a link into the description so you can check it out. This song was not mixed by me though, so the techniques that I'm going to show you were not actually used in the track that you can listen to, but they were mixed by our bass player Peter from Perfect Sounds Unleashed. And the tracks that you're listening to are provided by him, so thanks for that, and I'll put his socials in the description below. Now, we recorded this song in a professional studio called Studio Concreet in the Netherlands, mostly going through some nice API preamps, and we really had a blast doing this, and I figured these tracks, since they are live recorded, would be a nice example to show how you can go from a live recorded drum sound to a drum sound which is probably better to fit in a mix. Now, if we look at the tracks that I have here, you can see that I have overheads, I have a kick in and a kick out, a snare top and a snare bottom. I have a hi-hat track, but I'm actually not using it because the hi-hat is more than loud enough in the overheads and the other microphones. There's a floor tom track, although the floor tom is only used in a very small part of the sound, so we're not even going to listen to that in this video. Now, if I bring up the mixer view, you can see that I already have some basic processing on most of the tracks. An SSL 360 link plugin on all of them just for my SSL UF1 controller here. It doesn't actually do anything. And I have an SSL end console plugin on there just to bring up all the levels. There are some remnants of a gating test that I did, but I settled on the Oxford drum gate to get rid of some of the bleed of the other microphones in various channels. Now 1176 on the snare, UAD 1073 on the snare. And on the stereo out, I have my standard Oxford inflator and my Tegeler bus, which basically goes to my Tegeler Cream analog EQ and compressor, meant for on the mix bus. Now, if you want to listen to the raw drum recordings without any of this processing, it sounds like this. And then with. So it already does quite a bit, but we can still enhance that even more. I'm talking beyond the basic processing here in this video. And by the way, you can hear our singer in the background because this was all live recorded. So his vocal is bleeding on the drum tracks as well, mostly the overheads. Okay, so the first thing I think this drum recording needs is a bit more glue to glue all the sounds together, which you can do with a drum bus compressor, which is not on there yet at the moment. Now, there are several compressors that I've used in the past for this. For many years, for example, I used the UAD Fairchild as a drum bus compressor. Another very famous one for this purpose is an API 2500, which slams a bit more. But more recently, I found a plugin which is actually already quite old, but I think it works really well on a drum bus. And that's the Pulsar Mu, which is very Mu emulation. And even just the default that it comes up with, I like already quite a lot. So let's have a listen. Yeah, about up to 3 dB of compression. Let's listen to it with and without. Yeah, so to me it brings out really those low-level details a bit more, which makes it sound a bit more exciting. And it also puts more emphasis on the snare and the kick, so that the whole drum track slams a bit harder, but still the sounds come together a bit more. Now, next up is actually some drum enhancement with samples, because I recently discovered Joe Carrell's drum sample pack, and I think that pack contains some great samples to enhance drums in all kinds of styles. And it comes with a preset for Trigger 2, which is a plugin that you can use to replace enhanced drums by samples. So let's take a quick look at that. And the first drum that I want to enhance is the kick drum. And since we want those samples to be triggered by either the kick in or kick out, it's always a good idea to select the track which has the clearest kick triggers in them. And if I look at the waveform, I think these two don't really make that much of a difference, but typically the kick in, since the mic is inside the kick drum, has less bleed. Let's make a copy of this track. Let's call it kick sample trigger, which is only a temporary track, by the way. I will get rid of it later, but we need it now to put trigger 2 on there. So let's do that. And let's first select the sample that we want to use. And these are the kicks, which are in the trigger 2 presets of Joe Carrell's sample pack. And by the way, in the full sample pack, there are many more sounds than just these trigger 2 presets. But let's see if we can find a sound in here which goes well with our kick. And usually there's 2 approaches to that, for me at least. I either look for a sound which sort of adds what's missing from the original recording. So in this case, I feel the kick misses a bit of that click sound of a kick drum. So I could focus on finding a sound with a lot of that click in there. But the other approach would be that you find a kick sound which kind of resembles the originally recorded kick, but with just a bit more of what you're looking for in there. So that you can either use it to totally replace the original kick sound, or just use them both at the same time and that they really enhance each other. Now in this case, I think I'm going to go for that second approach. So I'm looking for a sound which sort of resembles the original kick, but with a bit more of that clicky sound in there. So let's have a look. So just as a reminder, this is our original kick sound. And let's see if we can find a sample which sounds sort of similar, but with a little bit more impact. And as you can see, quite a lot of different kicks. I think this one would fit really well. Let's put that on the pad over here and make sure that this sample is triggered every time our kick hits. Now how I typically do that is that I listen to the original sound, and every time I hear a kick sound, I want to see that trigger actually triggers the sample, which in this case for a kick is quite obvious, right? But if you have, for example, a snare track with a lot of bleed from the toms as well, then this is the way that you can listen to the original track and see whether the correct sample gets triggered or not. So let's see how that works in this case. Yeah, I want that low level kick hit also trigger the kick sample. And if we now listen to the replacement kick, it sounds like this. Yeah, I think that would be a great enhancer. Now next up, I'm not going to keep this track, but instead I'm going to render a new track with the new kick on there. So for that purpose, I go to Edit, Render in Place. Let's render with current settings. So over here is my new kick sample track. Let's get rid of the trigger track because we don't need that anymore. Move the kick sample below these original kick tracks. Maybe send them to a group. Finally going into the kick group track, but let's call this acoustic kick, for example. And then the kick sample itself also goes to the kick track. So this is a sample. And this is the acoustic kick. Yeah, so to me, it's still a bit of the same sound character, but with a bit more of that beater sound in there. Now, the next step is to make sure that this kick track actually aligns with the original kick. So I'm going to move it back over here for a second. And let's zoom in, because over here you can see that for the original kick, the waveform goes up first when it is triggered. But for the kick sample, it goes down first. And over here also this waveform is opposite. So going down on the original kick track and going up on the sample. That's something you typically do not want because that will sound a bit out of phase. So let's invert the phase of our sample here. And now you can see that the first part of the waveform goes up in both the original kick as well as the kick sample. Now let's listen to the difference. Because if we now mix them together, you can see that it sounds like this when they're aligned. And if I now undo the invert phase, it sounds like this. Yeah, so I don't know if you can hear it on the YouTube codec, but it almost sounds that they're not played exactly together, causing the sound to suffer. So we really need that inverted phase. Now, another thing that you typically need to check when you trigger a sample like this, that the phase relationship of the waveforms is like this for every kick hit. Because sometimes it happens that there's a bit of a mistrigger, so that the sample starts slightly later, and then you can get that weird sound again. So what I typically do is that I zoom in quite a lot on the first kick hit. And over here you can see that's perfectly in sync. And then I use Alt-N in Cubase to go to the next transient. And then you end up at every start of every kick hit basically. And then you can see whether it is aligned with the original kick. Yeah, so it also shows transients which are not exactly at the start of a kick hit. But again, this is the next one, perfectly aligned. Next one, perfectly aligned, etc. Now, sometimes if you encounter a case where the sample is misaligned with the original kick hit, I just cut it and put it back in place so that it is aligned again. And then you can get the nice enhanced kick sound on every kick hit. So I'm not going to bore you with this, so I will go over all the kick hits, make sure that they are aligned and in sync, and then we're going to have a listen to what this sample now adds to the kick hit. Okay, let's start with the kick sample at 0 and then slowly add it. So it definitely adds a bit of that beater sound to the original kick, but they sound very well together and the character is still very similar to the originally recorded kick. Now, before we have a look at the snare drum, if you like this video or find it useful at all, please give it a big thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm so that it gets shown to more people. Subscribe to the channel and ring the little bell icon so you get notified when I publish another video. For even more support, if you feel that I'm really telling you something that's very useful to you, you can consider using the super thanks button below the video, which is sort of a virtual tip jar, or if you're planning to buy anything at one of these stores, I have many affiliate links to them in the description below, and if you click one of those links and then make a purchase, I will get a small commission without any additional cost to you, which is very, very much appreciated. So let's go on by enhancing the snare with again a sample from the Joe Carrell Drum sample pack. So let's duplicate this snare bottom track over here. Let's call it snare sample trigger, which is again a temporary track. Let's put trigger 2 on there and see what kind of snare samples are in the Joe Carrell pack. Oh, quite a lot. Let's listen to some of them. Okay, after listening to all of them, I came to the conclusion that what this snare, the recorded snare, lacks is actually a bit of meat. So I feel that this sample here would actually be a good fit. So let's select that one. Let's trigger again by listening to the original track so that we're sure that we can see triggering on the actual snare sound. And the actual triggering you can see from those red dots here, of course, on the waveform. Yeah, you can see that sometimes some of the low level snare hits are not triggered, especially if the drummer is also playing ghost notes on the snare, for example. And I could possibly put the level down so that we also get a sample trigger on those ghost notes. But usually it's not really necessary unless you want to fully replace the original snare track, because the ghost notes will just come from the original recording. They usually sound a bit different as well. And only the louder snare hits will then be enhanced by the sample as well. So again, I rendered this track, got rid of the trigger track with the trigger 2 plugin on there, and then painstakingly went over all of the snare hits to make sure that they were in sync with the original snare sound. And by the way, the bottom snare mic is usually already reversed in polarity compared to the top snare mic. So it's better to both sync the polarity to the top snare track so that everything is completely in phase, in sync. Let's have a listen to that. So again, I have 3 snare tracks now. The snare top and the snare bottom were the recorded tracks going to the acoustic snare group, which is going to the snare group. And in between is the snare sample, which is also going to the snare group. So let's solo the snare and let's see what the sample brings to total snare sound, starting without. Yeah, well, it does exactly what I wanted. It brings some meat to the snare sound, providing more impact. So let's have a listen to the full drum sound now. And without samples. Well, I feel that's a lot better. Next up, what's also missing from this recording is the fact that we did not have a room mic. So we're kind of missing the space around the drum set, the room. So let's try to simulate that with a nice UAD plugin that I have for that. So let's add an effects track. And let's find UAD Sound City Studios. Definitely stereo. Room reverb. Now, as you can see, it simulates the room of, well, Sound City Studios in LA. And it has some room mics over here. But I kind of like the corner sound over here, which has a close mic enabled and a room mic. And I want to use the reverb of this plugin only. I don't want to remic all the drums through the Sound City preamps, which is also a possibility, by the way, but let's just use the reverb only for now. And I don't want to apply this on the full drum set, but instead I want to apply this reverb on some of the individual drums so that I have a bit more control. So as you can see, I've activated the send to the room reverb on the overheads, even though there's already a bit more of a spacious sound to begin with, of course, on the kick, on the snare, and on the floor tom, even though we're not really hearing the floor tom in this part of the track. Let's listen. Okay, let's listen to the full drum set with and without. Now the way I'm using it, I think it's quite subtle, but it does give a bit more space to the full drum set, so that it sounds more like it was actually recorded in a nice big room. And it actually was, but we just didn't have a room mic set up in that studio. Now let's add some less subtle reverb on the snare track, which is always nice with a bit more reverb. However, that will be a different reverb. Let's take the LX480 by Relab. And let's find a nice plate. Well, I think Joe Carrell actually has a plate on here. Let's choose his drum plate and see how that sounds on the snare. Let's set up the snare reverb. Send on the snare track. And let's see how this sounds. Yeah, that's actually quite a nice reverb for this snare. Now next up, I think this whole drum sound could still sound a little bit more exciting. So let's add a little bit more processing on the drum bus to affect the drum as a whole. And I recently bought a saturation plugin by SSL, which I find to work really well on a drum bus. So let's try that. And by the way, I think this was only like $10 or 10 euros at the time. So let's try the SSL native saturator. So let's see what that adds to this drum bus. Yeah, I do think this adds something, but maybe not flat out 100% on the drum bus. Fortunately, there's a dry wet knob on here as well. Let's see if we can tweak that a little bit. Yeah, I think it just adds a bit more excitement to the drums. Now finally, what I typically also do on a drum bus is that I add a clipper, just to kind of rein in those peaks that might slip through. And that might cause our full mix to contain some peaks, which the mastering otherwise will have to deal with. So let's just rein them in ourselves. And I'm using K-Clip 3 for that. I'm linking both the in and out knobs so that it will not make the signal louder, but it will just allow me to clip some of the worst peaks that we still have in this drum track. So let's have a look. Yeah, as you can see, there are still quite a few peaks here and there sometimes, and this clipper kind of contains that without immediately causing it to sound way different or saturated or distorted. So let's again listen shortly to the difference between the raw drum sound with some basic processing on there already and the enhanced drum sound with a drum bus compressor, samples enhancing the kick and the snare, some room reverb for the whole kit, some snare reverb on only the snare drum, and some saturation and clipping on the drum bus. Now, of course, this is just the drum sound of this track. I do usually start with just the drum sound, but when you add the other instruments, you probably have to tune the drum mix and the drum sounds, maybe cut out some frequencies or boost them based on the rest of the track. So what do you think? Is it improved? Do you feel it's worse maybe? It's also a matter of taste, of course. Would you process these drums completely different? Let us know in the comments and let's learn from each other. Now, if you're really into drum processing, I also recently did a video comparing some of the most well-known drum gates at this moment, which can be used to filter out microphone bleed, which is particularly important for live recorded drums. I'll link that video up here, check it out, enjoy, and see you soon.